Hey guys, All in Crypto here, and welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, for another show. Today we've got a very special guest lined up. We've got Bill Laboon, who is Head of Education and Grants at the Web3 Foundation, and is also an author with books like Strength in Numbers, which is a novel that teaches people about Bitcoin. Thank you very much for coming on, Bill. It's an absolute pleasure.
Yeah, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, I was very excited to get you on the show. We were talking a little bit off camera about just how excited I was when I started to understand Polkadot and how it really kind of reminded me of the first time I found Ethereum. You know, this kind of next generation of what we're doing with blockchain, you know, adding smart contracts to Bitcoin. And now I feel like we've evolved from that. And Polkadot very much is that evolution. So could I ask you to maybe give me a bit of an introduction to yourself?
Sure. Yeah. So as you mentioned, my name is Bill Laboon. I'm at Web3 Foundation in Zug, Switzerland. I come from a very, very long line of working with cryptocurrency and blockchain technology in general. I've been involved in it for about 11 years. Before this, I was a lecturer at the University of Pittsburgh in the computer science department, taught, as far as I know, the first undergraduate course on blockchain technology in that city. So my slight claim to fame. But I've been working with Polkadot and Web3 Foundation since the beginning of 2019.
Wow, yeah, this is why I'm so excited to get you on, because not only do you have such a wealth of knowledge with Polkadot, but also blockchain in general. You know, you've been here really for a long time, 11 years. I mean, you know, that's nearly half of my lifetime. So yeah. Could
Now
you
you're making
make
me feel old.
Yeah, not deliberate by any means. Could we maybe get some sort of an introduction to Polkadot, you know, a brief overview of what Polkadot is? Because I feel like lots of people in the blockchain space, Polkadot's one of the more complex blockchains to get your head around. And maybe, you know, if you could give us a sort of overview, as hard as that may be, that would be appreciated.
Yeah. So I think because Polkadot is trying to do several things and really trying to be the next generation blockchain, yes, it is kind of hard to put into words. But I'll say there's a few ideas I think that will just get the idea of Polkadot, what it's trying to do across. So the first thing to think about is this idea of layers, right? You've probably heard of layer twos, and Polkadot is a layer zero. Right. So the idea is people can build their own blockchains on top of Polkadot. The idea is not to build just a smart contract, although that is possible to do with Polkadot, but rather that people can make a blockchain that meets their own specific needs. Or if there's one that already exists, use that. So Polkadot consists of a relay chain. If you're familiar with Ethereum, this is similar to the beacon chain, whose job it is to coordinate other blockchains. And it secures these blockchains, it provides security for them, and allows them to interoperate and intercommunicate. So you can very easily have an asset on chain A and move it to chain B, or even call a smart contract from chain A, from chain B, et cetera. So the idea of Polkadot is essentially to create an internet of blockchains, that we can have a lot of different blockchains that are focused on different things that they're good for, right? And allow people to develop their own blockchains if there isn't something that works for them, but also allow them to all exist and interoperate and intercommunicate with each other in a much more secure manner than we see other inter-blockchain communications.
Yeah, this is what really excites me about Polkadot. It's doing things just simply different. You know, it's doing how we do blockchain in a completely different fashion. And what would you say some of the main features of Polkadot are that really sort of separate it from the pack, makes it different from other blockchains? It could be Substrate, it could be something along those lines.
Yeah, so you mentioned Substrate. I would say this is a big difference from other chains. So Substrate is a blockchain development framework written in Rust, although there are some teams that we've given grants to that are working on making other language versions. And this allows you to make your own blockchain, right? Actually relatively simply, a few steps. Maybe we can include some links, but substrate.dev will show you it's really, you type in 4 things at the command line, and you have your own blockchain with a basic user interface, and then you can adjust it from there. It's basically like Ruby on Rails or Django or something like that for blockchain. So, but I think that like the key aspect, like so Substrate is a big part of this, but I think the big difference is the idea of the rules for a Polkadot blockchain, right? For a parachain, as we call it, these chains that connect to the relay chain, or even the relay chain itself, is enclosed or included within the Genesis block of a chain. So what this means is, when you think of Bitcoin, right, the rules for Bitcoin are not on the chain. If you look at the Bitcoin chain, you won't see the rules, right? But you'll see the nodes, right, the node software, and they can look at the data on the chain and then interpret it. Right? It's the same with Ethereum, right? The rules for the Ethereum blockchain, for the EVM, they're all in the node software, the actual computers, and just the data is in the blockchain. So as you mentioned, like Polkadot operates a little bit differently, right? In Polkadot, the rules for the blockchain are actually included in the blockchain. So this is really, really useful and a really powerful idea, because it means a couple of different things. One is that it's sort of self-reviewing, right? If you load up the chain, you automatically know the rules for it, right? You as a node know the rules for it. This also means that it can be changed and very easily upgraded. So your listeners and you have probably heard of forks, right? Hard forks and soft forks. And these are a bit of a pain, right? Because you need to ensure that everybody has upgraded their software and all their nodes. There's the ability for these other forks to continue, right? So we've seen things like Bitcoin Cash, Ethereum Classic. Polkadot doesn't have that, right? Because the rules for changing the chain and upgrading it can be modified by the chain by just putting this new blob of WebAssembly, this code, the rules for the blockchain on the chain. So you can change it without changing the software, the node software at all, right? So you actually can upgrade forklessly, which is a huge, huge benefit. It makes upgrading so much easier. Polkadot has been around the mainnet for a little less than 3 years and launched May of 2020. And yet it's upgraded, I think, 47 times. Right.
And I think, sorry to interrupt you there, one of the beautiful things about that is people haven't probably largely even noticed, unless they're really into that side of things, that it's done that. And that's one of the beautiful things about it.
Yeah, barring a few updates for things that RPC connectivity, network connectivity and things like this, where we ask people to upgrade their nodes, you could essentially be running the same node and not even notice this fork. Never update the software; it's not necessary, right? So yes, unless you're really looking closely and seeing, all right, this new feature was added, you may not even notice that these upgrades are taking place.
Yeah, there's so, I mean, we could probably sit here for 6 or 7 hours talking about all the unique features that Polkadot has in opposition with other blockchains. What are some of the sort of exciting things that you see taking place with Polkadot right now? It doesn't even have to be Polkadot as the kind of relay chain. It could be some of what's taking place within the ecosystem, or the direction maybe things are heading. What's kind of exciting you right now generally about Polkadot?
Well, I would say there are 2 things happening on the relay chain that are very exciting. One is our upgrading of our governance mechanism. So something, again, that differentiates Polkadot from a lot of other systems is that all upgrades, all changes to the ecosystem have to be voted on, right? And we currently have a system that I think of as indirect democracy. Right, so people actually can get voted on to the Polkadot Council, and they vote in a technical committee, which can make certain changes. Now, even right now, any upgrade to the chain generally is voted on by all DOT holders. But with this new version, OpenGov, which is already running on our Canary network, Kusama, it is entirely direct democracy. right? And it allows lots of different votes to take place at the same time instead of a single a single vote at a time. So this allows a lot more interaction. We have like fluid, liquid delegations. You can delegate to different people for different kinds of votes. It's a really amazing governance system. But that we could have, actually tonight, I'm giving an entire hour-long talk just on that, so I won't dive too much into it. I already mentioned like the interoperability in our ecosystem. There's a new version of our XCM. It's called the cross-chain messaging format, which is coming out, XCM v3, which will allow not just easier communication and more powerful communication in our consensus network between Polkadot parachains and the Polkadot relay chain, but also allows the capability to interact with other consensus systems using this same XCM format, which is, I think, really cool, right? Again, our idea is to make the internet of blockchains, and that means interacting with other chains that are out there. So those, I'd say, those are two things like just for Polkadot that I'm very excited about, but I also can go into a bit of detail of like what's happening in our ecosystem if you're curious about that as well.
Yeah, for sure. You brought up two pretty massive points there. Governance. I feel like the majority of people in the blockchain space right now don't really realize just how much of a big deal governance actually is, right? Governance is really a fundamental part to blockchain. It's one of the pillars. If you look at what we're trying to do here, we're trying to move to a decentralized sort of ecosystem, and governance is a massive, massive part of that. Just a question for you on that. Is there an incentive that you offer people to take part in governance? Because I've often found that, and I've seen many kind of different governance models. Some offer almost bribes to take part in governance, which I'm not sure is the best method. But is there some kind of a incentive or a reason why people should take part in Polkadot's governance?
So yeah, I mean, this is a really hard question, both in
for sure,
blockchain governance especially, but also in like normal nation state governance, right? And there have actually been some experiments in the ecosystem of providing, for example, NFTs. Like if you can look at my my Bill account on Kusama, so I have an on-chain identity Bill. So if anyone wants to look up what I'm doing, feel free. And you'll see I have a bunch of these just NFTs, right, from taking part in voting. But in general, what we've, after talking with our researchers, providing incentives for taking part in governance actually can be very counterproductive.
Yeah.
And so we right now don't have any incentives for doing it, but our goal is to make it as easy as possible for you to participate in governance. So I know this is something that people have often said that sometimes Polkadot is difficult to understand. We are actually trying to make it as easy as possible to do so, and making the user interface better, providing more explanations. But this is our real goal, is not to incentivize it. We're hoping that people will have if they care about things, they'll vote on it, but rather to make it easy and make it easy to understand for people who want to know, all right, well, what does this mechanism do, right? If I'm voting yes on this, what does that actually mean for the network and for me? And that's really our main goal, is to make it easy.
Yeah, I love that. I think that's really important, is to not necessarily incentivize people, because and I won't mention any ecosystems in specific, but what I found with other ecosystems that will incentivize you with maybe extra staking rewards or something like that is people just vote for whatever, just to say they've taken part and get the rewards. Whereas I feel like the approach with Polkadot is you're really trying to educate people to make that decision correctly, rather than saying, look, here you are, just vote and we'll put a tick next to your name.
Right. I mean, yeah, you can imagine, and this is one of the things, right? When we have actually like, an economics researcher here at Web3 Foundation who's like, done research on this. And, so what is your incentive, right? If you get something, but it doesn't matter if you vote yes or no, then you're whatever, I was going to randomly vote. And we actually have seen this. I mentioned, there were some scripts on Kusama, there were NFTs that you would get on Kusama, and people wanted these NFTs, and they would make a bunch of accounts that would just randomly vote. And then they said, well, it only would count if you vote for something that's already passing, right? And this NFT team. It's not an official Web3 thing. It was just this team that got funding from the treasury to try something out. And then what you saw was everyone just immediately voted for whatever the majority was, right? So
Wow.
it's interesting, right? I mean, that's why we have Kusamas. We can try these things out, see what works in a real economic environment. But the motto of Kusama is expect chaos, right?
Yeah.
So we tried a lot of this stuff out, but yeah, what we have discovered is really the way forward is just to educate people, which really is in line with my own personal philosophy as well.
Yeah, for sure. You mentioned Kusama, which I'd love to get onto. You also mentioned, some exciting things taking place with the ecosystem. But before we get onto that, you mentioned XCM.
Yep.
Could we maybe get a bit of a sort of crash course into or an explanation on what XCM is and why it's such a big deal? Web3 foundation. When you think about Web2 and what you can do with Web2, Polkadot really is trying to be the Web3. Facilitate the internet of you being able to build what you want and connect and do all these weird and wonderful things. But XCM is interesting, and you mentioned you've got a new version coming out. Could we maybe just get an introduction to what XCM is and why it's such a big deal?
Sure. So I think to really understand XCM, we should think about how cross-chain interactions have occurred in the past, right? So in the early days, you had things like atomic swaps, where basically one account could get some Litecoin and the other account could get some Bitcoin. It was a very slow process, and what we've seen is then there was a lot of these bridges, right, where you just lock some tokens up here and get some representation of that token over there. There's a lot of problems with these, right? We've seen a lot of bridge hacks. We've seen how slow atomic swaps are. So what we have done with Polkadot in general, right, is ensure that this is a much more secure way to interact across chains and much more powerful. Right. So atomic swaps, again, very, very simple. I want to get this token, I want to get this token. XCM allows you to do all kinds of things, move NFTs trustlessly from one system to another, call a smart contract from chain A to chain B. For instance, monitor things, across networks, across chains trustlessly. So what XCM v3 is bringing so this is what XCM brings. We have XCM v2, and essentially what we're doing is you're making this more powerful and more secure, right? And also sort of universalizing it a bit so that it can interact with chains that are not part of Polkadot. Other chains can be a part of this ecosystem in an easy way. So that's like the main goal of XCM as a whole, and V3 is bringing these capabilities, like especially the smart contract calls and the monitoring of other chains. You can do something chain A and verify, call chain B and then verify that thing has happened on chain B and then do something back on chain A. And because of the shared security of Polkadot, this is all happening under the same consensus mechanism, which means it's just like a multi-call, right, in Ethereum, right, where everything happens. You can verify that everything happens. It's all in the same consensus system. You don't have to worry that like a bridge is going to be hacked, right? That concept doesn't really exist because it's all being verified by the relay chain. So what this means is you can have this cross-chain communication that's very fast, very powerful, and very secure. So compared to a lot of these other cross-chain interactions and other ecosystems.
Yeah, we've seen interoperability be a real pain point. I've been around since really the start of Ethereum's DeFi, the whole DeFi space that took place there. And I feel like interoperability is still a problem that's being worked on. And this is a question that I'm really more curious about, because I've often thought, do we actually need to physically move an asset from one chain to another, or can we just do that via messaging? Are we trying to reinvent the wheel here when we already have the wheel? Or does XCM sort of utilize, is it more of a messaging service, or are you actually physically, for example, taking an asset from a star to Moonbeam? Or is it just a message that sort of locks one end and creates on the other?
So Yeah, so it actually can. It's like, I like to think of it. In fact, we've used this term as like, it's like teleporting, right? In Star Trek, you actually can destroy the asset on one and have it exist in another. And but because they're part of the same consensus system, right? There's the way this is communicated is all via messaging, right? But that's the actual like messaging. That's a XEMP. That's our protocol for how these messages go from one system to another. But because everything is secured by the relay chain, so what the relay chain is doing is ensuring essentially that everyone is following the rules. Like
It's
that's all it.
synced up. Yeah.
Yeah, that's all that it does. So right, that if you destroy whatever, you have an Astar, an Astar token here, and then that gets destroyed, burned, and then all right, now you have this XC Astar, five get burned here and five appear here. Like the cosmic scale, right, still balances, right, and this is verified by the relay chain. You
Yep.
can't you it's impossible, right? So in a traditional system, you couldn't do this, right? If it's like a one-way. I guess there were some examples of like one-way burns, like counterparty with Bitcoin. You would send Bitcoin to a burn address, and then you would get some counterparty tokens in return. But then there was no way to get that Bitcoin back, right? It's forever burned. And then we've seen with bridges, like essentially it's like locking up, right? That I have some whatever. I have some Bitcoin and I lock it up, and then I tell you, like, look, I can prove to you I have 5 Bitcoin, and I'll give you 5 ETH Bitcoin, and you can always just reimburse them to me as a centralized entity. And this level of the centralized entity kind of varies, right? You can have multi-sigs and do things that make it a little less centralized, but this key aspect still occurs, right? You're then trusting me or the multi-sig that represents me, or you have a one-way burn, which is more secure, but then you can't go back and forth. So XCM really allows you, right, because it has this shared security, because all of these chains are operating under the same consensus and coming to the same truth, that allows you to do these more complicated and more exciting and more flexible things, and do them in a less trustful way, like, right? You can actually do this trustlessly.
Yeah, I think it's brilliant. This is what I love about Polkadot. It's really exploring these new kind of concepts and different ways of doing things. And I often think that with interoperability, people are almost trying to invent the wheel. They don't just want messaging. They want to actually physically take an asset from one chain and put it to another. And it's kind of like, well, why are you trying to do that? You could just do that via messaging and accounting, basically, rather than physically trying to teleport something to somewhere else. And I always look at Polkadot as a kind of what right now could be, I think, described as a microcosm of the cryptocurrency space at large. If you think about crypto and you think about how you've got Ethereum, which is a smart contract blockchain, and then you've got something like Bitcoin or, a stable coin protocol. Polkadot is almost like a microcosm of that, but with interoperability. And all these other unique features. It's really exciting.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at like some of the parachains running on Polkadot now, so we actually have Moonbeam, which is essentially Ethereum. It's meant to be as Ethereum-like as possible. You can run your Solidity smart contracts. We've got A Star, which can not only run Solidity, which we just mentioned, A Star, but also Ink, or other WebAssembly-based smart contracts, right? And then these can interact with each other. We have DeFi-specific chains, like Akala, like Mangata, like Hydra, that you are very focused on DeFi, and some of these are like anti-MEV chains, right? To make sure that you can't have this minor or maximum extractive value, right? We have others that are like trying new cool things. But you can think of this, yeah, it is. We have Interlay, which allows you access to Bitcoin, right? So you can have this trustlessly wrapped Bitcoin. Yeah, so it really is like you can stay in the Polkadot ecosystem and do all using the same like wallet software and everything. Interact with all these different chains for something where to do this with other chains would require like several different wallets and lots of like trusting centralized entities to move move tokens from one chain to another, understanding like the different aspects of the system and the little little weirdnesses that go along with every blockchain ecosystem. But in Polkadot, you can sort of try all of this stuff out and have them interact with each other, tie them together, and do this all like using, the same, if you have a script that works with Moonbeam, it's probably going to work with A-Star. If you have a script that works, right, on the relay chain, you can get it to work with our asset parachain statement, et cetera. So it lets you, come up. It is a little bit more complicated because of this flexibility, but like once you understand like the basic concepts, they can be applied to this whole, universe of chains. There are dozens of chains running on Polkadot. I think there are around 50 or so on Kusama, and 30 something. So I should have probably checked out these numbers right beforehand. They're always increasing.
Absolutely.
But you can try out all of these different chains using, the same software and the same sort of basic ideas, but then see how they've been applied in different ways.
Yeah, I think this is a key part to sort of mass adoption for blockchain is making it easy to use. You have to have this kind of one-stop shop. If my grandma, who I have, she's got a couple of MetaMasks, believe it or not, that was not an easy sort of process to go through with her, unfortunately. But in order for blockchain, I think to gain or to get to mass adoption, it needs to be easy to use. And I feel like Polkadot are doing a really good job of creating that sort of one-stop shop. Just a quick question on parachains. Is there a limit to how many parachains can run on Polkadot? That's an interesting question, I feel.
That is a really good question. And the answer is yes. So essentially, what the relay chain is doing is, verifying the parachains. Anytime the parachain makes a block, I'm simplifying a bit, but the relay chain has to say like, okay, that block is valid, right? You're not breaking any rules. And of course, this takes computational time, and there's a limit to that, especially because we have a 6-second block time on the relay chain, and so there's only so much time, right, that you can allocate to this. So the early days, our estimate was that Polkadot could handle up to 100 parachains. So if you look at some of the early work, but this was just an estimate. Turns out there's a lot of efficiencies that can be made to do this, and so we don't have a number, but based on the stuff we're working on, we don't have a maximal number right now. We're not seeing any problems with the numbers we have now, which is in the dozens, and even on Kusama, even more than that. We're thinking maybe 200 or 300. But for sort of the far future, basically we call nested or hierarchical relay chains, where you have a relay chain that has other relay chains as parachains, and so then you have a relay chain that let's say handling 100 of these other relay chains as parachains, and each of those has 100. It's like, all right, well, that's 10,000 right there.
Wow. Yeah.
And maybe even progressing that further. So like, relay chains of relay chains of relay chains. But that's, and there are other ideas, right, that we're working on, things like parathreads, where you can have a parachain that doesn't always have to use the relay chain. So actually, like, interacting with Bitcoin would be a good example, because Bitcoin, we have 6-second relay chain blocks, and Bitcoin, not quite 6-second block times, right? around 10 minutes on average. And so you may not need to stay connected, right? So if you're interacting with Bitcoin, maybe you connect once every 10 minutes, or whenever a new Bitcoin block comes in. So you can have these parathreads that only connect and make a new block at certain intervals. And obviously that would mean that you'd have much more time, right, for verifying these things, because you don't have to be verifying so often. So there are a lot of tricks to increase this, but as we're not really at the limits yet of what we can handle, again, probably around 200 or 300. These are things that are being worked on, but they're, in terms of scalability, I feel like we're not anywhere near the limits of this Polkadot model.
Yeah, it's really, really fascinating. I love the pay to kind of play model, not just economically, but also in terms of being efficient, that Polkadot has. Because I feel like there's a lot of blockchains out there that you don't really need what you're getting. One of the thing that I always laugh at is when you see blockchains say they can do like 100,000 transactions per second, and I'm like, who is using 100,000 transactions per second? It's just such wasted efficiency. Could we maybe go into the app not app, sorry, parachain ecosystem. What's really exciting you, because I constantly watch GitHub. Polkadot's constantly at the top of GitHub. What's exciting you right now that's taking place there? Because I see lots of things like security, privatization, smart contracts. I see so much going on there. What's something that you're excited about that's taking place within your sort of parachain ecosystem at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, there are all kinds of exciting things happening. And I'll be honest, like, one of the things that is most exciting to me is when I see things that simply would not be capable in other ecosystems, right? Because because of substrate, because of this, like, again, this very simple concept, right, of keeping the rules on the blockchain and not as part of a separate node actually has a lot of like, far-reaching ramifications. And so because of this, we're seeing some like really cool stuff happening in the ecosystem. Something that I have always thought is very interesting is we're seeing social networks built, that run on blockchain. So Subsocial is the oldest one. Working in Substrate and working with IPFS, you can actually interact and make your own social network. Polkaverse is their big one. That's run on a blockchain. You have some tokens on there that you can then send to people or do all this. And they've taken this idea and also have done things like post forever, which is take a tweet and actually put it on IPFS to make sure that it stays there forever. So they've taken this idea, right, of social networking on the blockchain and have really tried a lot of different things out with it. I've always thought that was a very interesting thing. Interlay, which is trustless Bitcoin wrapping, and then you could use IBTC on for whatever you want to use elsewhere in the Polkadot ecosystem, but it's done trustlessly, which I think is really cool. It's not there's not a centralized entity. There's these decentralized vaults, and they are in fact using Substrate. They are incentivized to keep running these Bitcoin nodes, and then you can lock your Bitcoin up trustlessly and unlock it trustlessly, which again, as an old Bitcoin guy, I thought was really cool, right? Doing something with your Bitcoin and trying out this new stuff in Polkadot with it. Yeah, the different smart contract chains. We already mentioned Moonbeam, which but A-Star I've been really looking into because they are supporting Ink, which is a Rust-based smart contract programming language. So I've been playing around with that a bit. Solidity is there are a lot of issues with it, right? And not to mention it's just it's its own language, right? It's something separate you have to learn. Whereas if you know Rust, then basically Ink, and you can use all the tools of the Rust ecosystem, for that you're familiar with, to use that. So that's something I think is really cool. Is starting with A-Star, you can learn Rust, write some smart contracts, and then say, hey, maybe this isn't quite powerful enough for me, so I'm going to still use Rust and write a palette. Right, so a palette is like a library that blockchains can use, and then again, still using Rust, you can say, oh, I want to build my own parachain. So I've gone the whole stack, right? It reminds me a lot actually of Node.js, right? So again, I'm an old guy. I remember when JavaScript was just used for front end stuff. It was just this little toy language. But then we got Node, and then you could do the whole stack in the same language, and that makes things a lot easier than learning lots of different languages, right? And I think this is what A-Star is doing, and some other chains are working on this as well, is like a Node.js moment, right, where you can get this power of a single language, and use it all the way across the stack, or up and down the stack, I guess.
Yeah, it's I think one big barrier to sort of getting into blockchain and building with blockchains is the languages that you need to sort of know to be able to do that. And I think that, bringing things like WASM and the languages that are involved in that to the blockchain space and allowing people to build with it, I think is a really, really big deal. I mean, there's so much going on with the Polkadot ecosystem. Like I say, we could spend hours and hours talking about it all and all the amazing things that are taking place. What are some of the real world use cases that you see Polkadot sort of filling, because I think there's a lot of kind of jargon out there with blockchains where they're not really needed for anything. However, I think Polkadot, and given the kind of scope of things that it's doing, you're going to see it really start to come into the real world more and more. And I'm sure you think, like myself, blockchain's a real technological revolution. We're on the internet right now on a PC. We drive cars. These are all revolutions that have came before us. I think blockchain is no different, and we're going to be using it in tomorrow's world without even knowing that we're using it. So what are some of the real sort of world use cases you see for Polkadot, maybe right now or moving down the line?
Yeah, so one of the more interesting ones that I've seen recently that I think makes a lot of sense is peer-to-peer accounting. So Totem, which has a parachain on Polkadot as well as one on Kusama, allows real-world accounting. Okay, that you can use and store information on the blockchain and interact with other companies that are using this. And it turns out, I'm not an accountant, but I've given some talks to accountants and talked to their groups. And a lot of accounting fraud takes place after the fact. So it turns out that it's not often the case that accountants, they're trying to cook the books, are doing this ahead of time. Afterwards they look at the numbers. After something happens, they look at the numbers and see how they can mess with things. But if all this is on the blockchain, it's immutable. You can't do that, right? So we've just eliminated a huge percentage. If we get more people to use this, a huge percentage of possible accounting fraud. Which is great, right? Nobody likes accounting fraud. There's a lot of stuff happening with zero knowledge that I think is really interesting, which again, that sounds like jargon, but what it really means is perfect privacy, right? And so Manta, for instance, which is a parachain and they've just launched Manta Pay on their Kusama parachain, uses zero knowledge to have perfect privacy. So, again, you look at Bitcoin, you look at Ethereum, you can see what everyone's doing. You look at Monero, it's a little bit more difficult to do it, but with something like shielded transactions and Zcash, use zero knowledge, it's sort of a perfect secrecy, and that we're seeing that now on Polkadot, right? And a big part of this again is you have the ability not just at the smart contract level, but at the blockchain level, right, to make these changes and try new things. Decentralized identity is another thing, right? So Kilt, which is a parachain on Polkadot, allows you to make an identity. You've got the self-sovereign identity, and you can then prove who you are, but only prove to certain people, right? And only prove certain facts. Sort of the traditional idea is, if you go to a bar right now, at least in the US, you have to show your driver's license, which shows you all kinds of information. It shows that the bouncer at the bar all kinds of information about you. But all they really need to know is, are you above the age of 21 or 18 or whatever? And with decentralized identity, you can do that. You can use these proofs to only share the knowledge that you want to share. And then building on this, right? We have Polymech, which is another parachain coming in the ecosystem. I think they have not yet won a slot, if memory serves. But their idea is to allow people to use AML KYC, but do it in a privacy-preserving manner. So you can participate in whatever funding events and get verified, but do it without having somewhere a big list of everyone's real name, real social security number, real birth date, all this stuff. But you'll be able to prove that you have this information, that you are a valid investor. So I think we're just starting now to see the real world use cases launch. And so again, Polkadot is relatively new. It's relatively new ideas, and so it's taken a while, I think, for these stuff to develop on them and be ready for production. But I think we're starting to see that over the last 6-7 months, like these very real world, non-crypto native things that are actually useful to people outside of our ecosystem.
Yeah, I think this is one of the things that excites me most about Polkadot is how new it is, right? It seems like it is still relatively new, and yet there's so much that sort of came out of it. I've looked at Manta Pay. I think that's nothing short of a genius idea, right? You'll be able to take any token on Polkadot essentially and privatize it. Mm-hmm. Which some people will say, oh, well, why do you need to privatize it? Maybe there's something nefarious on the back end of that, but not at all. This is sort of, do you want everybody reading your bank statement every month. You know, I certainly don't. I've got some
Yeah.
skeletons in that closet. So and there's just so much going on. I read I read it on my channel a while ago. The Bank of International Settlements not that long ago came out and said that they had essentially lost nearly $80 trillion in dollar denominated debt, loans, and swaps out there within Europe.
Wow.
I mean, what more of a kind of blockchain campaign or a better blockchain campaign could you get? You know, you couldn't do that on a blockchain. You can't just lose money and the accounts. To move
Or
on,
at
I mean,
least you could, but you would know where it went.
absolutely, and somebody would be getting the bill for that, you know. So
Yes.
it's, or at least an account would. And you mentioned identity as well. This is still something that I think is pretty new to blockchain. Still, there's a lot of people that are kind of going, we don't want identity, you know, we like just sort of people not knowing who owns the wallet or the identity behind it. But actually, I think the world that blockchain, certainly if you look at the United States, for example, I don't think blockchain, I think it could exist in an unregulated fashion, but I think more than likely if it's to gain adoption in the US, it has to be regulated. And I think actually identity, and correct me if you think I'm wrong at any point here, is a big part of that. You know, identity, I think, really has to be, you know, be at the forefront of what blockchain's doing. Certainly in somewhere like the US, that's going to require regulation for it to really excel. I don't know if you've got any sort of points on how you see that going.
I mean, I have a lot. I have a lot of thoughts on both identity and regulation. Polkadot, just as background, we've really tried to be regulatorily compliant, and especially in the United States. So we announced, I guess a few months ago now, that DOT has morphed and should no longer be considered a security. It is now, it is now software.
Yep.
And so we understand, we live in a world of laws, right? And we have done everything we could to ensure that we're following the regulations, and also interacting a lot with various regulatory agencies to ensure, right, that we are following the regulations, and also giving feedback on what we think is good for the ecosystem. So in terms of identity, so yeah, and regulation, like I understand, right? We live, blockchain exists. It certainly could exist in a regulatorily free environment, but that I think would really limit its use cases. And same with identity. There are a lot of things that without identity are difficult, if not impossible, to do on chain. So for instance, right now, in DeFi, you'd mentioned you got into this with DeFi, over collateralized loans are the norm, right? In DeFi, I think there have been a few experiments with uncollateralized loans that have, as far as I know, all failed spectacularly, because it's so easy for someone to take funding. But you think about like going to a bank. It is very rare to have an over collateralized loan. Okay, and unless you count mortgages, I guess they technically, on a house, that's you have the house as backup. There is, but you can get an uncollateralized loan, to start a business, right, or buy something that you need. Credit cards essentially are uncollateralized loans. And this is a big part. I'm not saying they're good or bad, but they're a big part of finance. And you can't really do that unless you know the identity of someone, right? That you have some recourse. But there are a lot of problems with this as well, right? With giving your identity. So what I love about blockchain, and what I love about the Polkadot ecosystem, is really you have your choice, right? For your particular use case, is it more useful to have privacy or pseudonymity? Or is it better to have an identity for you, right? It varies. Or do you want to, with decentralized identity and self-sovereign identity, is there particular pieces of your identity that you want to let others know and prove? Or do you want to go entirely private, right? With Manta, and you have perfect privacy over your assets. And so it's a spectrum, right? And I feel like it's not a question of like, one or the other. It's not like, all right, we have to go back to the early cypherpunk days of Bitcoin, right? When or we have to have like a central bank digital currency where, the government is in charge and can always freeze your account. And, you have to, whatever, put all your identifying information on chain. But I think, for different people, for different use cases, right? Here in Switzerland, I'm going to have very different use cases than someone under a tyrannical government somewhere, right? And what I want to do in terms of blockchain. And so providing those options, I think, is really valuable. And I think Polkadot gives you like the chance, right, to adjust that sliding scale for your particular needs.
Yeah, I absolutely love that about blockchain myself. It's going to allow you to opt in and out depending on what you're doing. It gives you this kind of freedom to choose. And actually, if we look at, you mentioned social networks, for example, and sort of, we've seen some really interesting things come up with web browsers and how they can interact blockchain into it and actually allow you the choice to have your data shared or not shared. Blockchain is solving so many different issues. Privacy is one, finance, a whole variety of things. But I think you're definitely onto it there, that, there's this uniqueness with blockchain that it will allow you to choose where you do say, look, this is me, or I don't need to say this is me, so I'm not going to. More of a sort of general question. We've not really touched on Kusama, but I'm a bit mindful of time. More of a sort of general question for you, Bill, as somebody that's been in the blockchain space for so long. What do you see coming for the future of blockchain? Do you see this as a technology that we're all going to be using in tomorrow's world, or what generally, how do you see blockchain playing out?
Yeah, I see blockchain right now as kind of like email in the 1990s. I remember, again, I'm old, right? Where, email was difficult. Connecting to the internet was difficult. And people would complain about PPP versus SLIP. And all right, I got to download some software to get this, and I need to call somebody, and my computer's making funny noises, and I can't use the phone. Right? And now we don't think about email, right? It's become very easy to use. It's become and the parts that are difficult. I remember, again, I'm very old, but my mom asking me, like, where's the at key, right? This, this, I don't know what you call it. Like, I see this like A with a circle around it. Where is that on the keyboard? And nowadays we don't think about it, right? And I think blockchain is going to be the same way. Like, right now, people are still figuring out wallets and, and private keys and seeds and seed phrases, but I think this is going to be something that's just, as time goes on and people see the usefulness of blockchain, they'll learn how to use it, right? I mean, it's never going to be quite like Web2. There's going to be some different paradigms, but in a lot of ways it's better, right? Logging in with MetaMask or Polkadot.js or whatever, like in some ways that's a lot easier than remembering your password, putting it in LastPass or 1Password or whatever, or memorizing a bunch of passwords. Instead, you just click and I'm logged in, right? I'm just using my MetaMask account or my Polkadot.js account or my Talisman account or whatever on any website. I have it, right, all secured by my private key. So I think it's a paradigm shift, and it takes a while for people to learn what they need to learn. It's not the future is not going to be just Web 2, but with a blockchain underneath it. Right? There are some things people have to learn, but I think what you have to learn is not as bad as people think, and it's going to be getting easier and easier, and more people will be doing it as they see the benefits, right? And I realize sometimes in our ecosystem, in our industry, we don't always do a great job of explaining the benefits. It's something that we should work on, but I really think as we do that, it's going to be just like email. More and more people will use it. They won't even think about it, right? That they're using a blockchain. It'll just be part of the normal thing you do, just like checking your email in the morning.
Yeah, no, I'm totally in line with that. Anything that you sort of, first start out doing is often quite hard and takes a little bit of time to wrap your head around, but ultimately becomes very easy. I remember playing around with MSN and things like this, and then now it's, we're in a different world. Yeah. So Bill, it's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you, my friend. you know, we could sit here and talk for hours and hours and hours about so many different things because there's just so much happening within Polkadot. We didn't really get a chance to touch on Kusama, but I'm sure I would certainly love to have you back on the show at some point. It's been fascinating just talking to you thus far. It's been a pleasure, Bill. Thank you very much for coming on the show. I'm going to leave a link to where they can find yourself, the Web3 Foundation, some stuff on Polkadot in the description. Bill, it's been an absolute pleasure to have you on the show.
All right. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.